The New Mexico State Penitentiary Riot was the most violent revolt in U.S. prison history. It took place on the 2nd and 3rd of February 1980. By the time police regained control, after 36 hours of mayhem, 33 inmates were dead and over 200 injured. The prison had been a tinderbox waiting to catch fire. Serious overcrowding had long been a problem. Close to 1,200 prisoners were in the facility on the night of the riot. The prison was designed for only about 950. Many prisoners slept on the floor in dormitories, and first-time offenders, convicted for minor crimes, were not segregated from some of the worst criminals in the state. Recreational and educational programs had been dropped in 1975, resulting in longer lockdowns for inmates and deepened rage against the prison system. Conditions were horrendous. The food was poor. Cell blocks were infested with vermin and cockroaches. Officer brutality was a problem. Inmates reported being kicked and struck when being transferred between different areas of the prison. A work strike against poor conditions in 1976 saw prisoners tear-gassed, stripped naked, and beaten with axe handles. Prison authorities deliberately set inmates against each other in a policy known as the snitch game. A so-called snitch jacket would be placed on troublesome prisoners, or to coerce those inmates thought to be in possession of information that would be useful to inform on others. Inmate-on-inmate violence increased, and scores would be settled once the riots began. The understaffed guards felt threatened during night counts. As a result, security procedures were not adhered to. Doors were left open to facilitate a quick escape in the event of trouble. On the night of the riot, prisoners had been drinking hooch they had made on the unguarded blocks. The plan had been hatched during this time, the idea being to jump the guards on the 1 a.m. count if they didn't lock the door behind them. Sure enough, the door was left open, and the prisoners pounced, seizing 3 officers making the count and the officer manning the cell door. The rioters headed straight for the control room, and despite the glass being supposedly bulletproof, smashed their way in. They now had complete control of the prison and access to every key. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. The 2 main gangs in the prison, the Chicanos and the Aryan Brotherhood, settled scores as soon as they were released. A group known as the Execution Squad, headed for Cell Block 4, where informers, sex offenders, and other prisoners that had been marked for death were held. Stopping along the way at the psychology wing to load up on drugs, which they either consumed or shared out for later, they were high and thirsty for revenge when they arrived at Cell Block 4. However, they didn't have the correct keys for the cells. It seemed as if the Block 4 prisoners would be saved. Unfortunately for them, contractors working on renovations to Cell Block 5 had left behind oxyacetylene torches, which the prisoners used to break in. The terrified inmates in Cell Block 4 had to listen as the mob got closer and closer to getting into their cells, one by one. Block 4 inmates screamed desperately to the state police outside, as there was a back door that could have been opened, potentially facilitating an escape. But the state police had agreed with hostage negotiators not to enter, since it may have prompted the rioters to harm or kill the officers who were still being held hostage. They watched on helplessly as a total of 16 inmates were tortured and killed by about noon on Saturday morning. Later that afternoon, a fire that had been started in the gymnasium spread to Cell Block 3, threatening 3 of the officer hostages who were being held there. This intensified negotiations, which the prison authorities had initiated about 2:30 a.m. on the Saturday morning. The prisoners demanded reform of conditions, that no charges be brought against them, and to be interviewed by the media. The authorities wanted the safe release of all hostages. Negotiations broke off on Saturday evening, resumed on Sunday morning, and by mid-afternoon, the riot was over, officers had been released, and police entered the prison. Water and fire damage was extensive. Then the police came upon the horrific scenes of the remains of the murdered inmates, many of whom were too badly disfigured to be immediately identified. New Mexico's Attorney General was commissioned to report on the riot, and his findings ran to 200 pages. He concluded that the prison regime had made violent criminals even more brutal. It also emerged that the riot was orchestrated by a small number of inmates, and that the vast majority of prisoners were actually trying to flee the mayhem for their own safety. Not all of the 33 deaths were murders. A number of inmates had died from drug overdoses. Several prisoners were charged with murder. None were convicted due to a lack of evidence. There were convictions for other offences. The longest sentence added for the riot was 9 years. No discernible change in prison conditions took place in the aftermath. It wasn't until a change of governor in New Mexico that any meaningful reforms occurred in the years following the riot. The building continued to deteriorate, and the penitentiary was slowly wound down, then eventually closed in 1998. In 2013, the building was open for visitor tours. The New Mexico State Penitentiary stands as a monument to brutality and inhumanity, both from the authorities and from inmates who rampaged out of control for 36 hours, displaying how far humans can sink into the depths of depravity.